A poor boy rescues a millionaire's daughter during a blizzard. But this unexpected encounter reveals dark secrets that could change their lives forever. Jacob tightened the sled's harnesses with steady but weary hands as the wind howled around him like a never-ending wail. Ahead of him, 3 dogs stood silently, their eyes gleaming against the endless blanket of snow. Max, the pack's leader, slowly waggled her tail, seemingly prepared for yet another challenging day. Adjacent to Max, Snowy remained vigilant, her ears pricked and her muscles tensed, poised for action. Meanwhile, Spot, the smallest of the trio, shuffled excitedly in place, eager to get moving. These weren't just working animals. They were Jacob's chosen family, companions who faced every challenge alongside him in the harsh mountains. With a simple command, Jacob set them into motion. "Let's go, Max, Snowy, Spot. It's time to work." The dogs surged forward, pulling the sled steadily over the thick snow. The sled itself was a humble creation, scraps of wood Jacob had salvaged and reinforced with ropes. Although it lacked elegance, it successfully accomplished its task. He trusted it as much as he trusted his loyal dogs. That day, the cold was harsher than usual, and a looming storm made the snow fall faster, quickly erasing the sled's tracks. Jacob knew he had to hurry to complete the final delivery and make it back home, where his grandmother Rose was waiting for him. Since the loss of his parents, Jacob had become accustomed to bearing the burden of the world. His brown eyes, shadowed with premature weariness, still held a spark of determination. Thomas and Diana, his parents, had worked tirelessly at a local factory until an accident changed everything. The explosion that claimed their lives left Jacob with an indescribable void. He was only 10 years old then, and the sound of sirens still echoed in his mind, as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. That night, Rose hugged him tightly, promising they would take care of each other, even when the world seemed to fall apart. Since then, Jacob had taken on the role of the family's provider, setting aside his childhood dreams to support the woman who, despite her frail health and advanced age, remained his greatest source of strength. As he trekked through the snowy path, Jacob watched the dogs move with grace and power. They were the reason he could cover the long distances between the remote mountain homes, delivering supplies and vital packages to the few families who relied on him. Every delivery felt like a mission, and every journey was a struggle with the elements. When the sled grew too heavy or the path too steep, Jacob jumped down to help, pushing with all his strength while encouraging his team. "Come on, Max. You've got this, Snowy. Spot, you can do it." Their bond ran deep, built on trust and their shared need to survive. But something about that day felt different. There was an unfamiliar chill in the air that went beyond the freezing wind. The sky, once merely overcast, had darkened to an ominous grey. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic sound of paws hitting the snow and the sled gliding behind them. Jacob paused for a moment, wiping his brow as beads of cold sweat mixed with the icy moisture on his face. A sense of unease crept over him. Something was coming. He could feel it. Valerie stood in front of a spotless mirror, adjusting the collar of her luxurious coat with meticulous precision. The enormous room around her reflected the grandeur of the house, but it did little to mask the emptiness she constantly felt. Her movements were deliberate, almost robotic, as she tried to block out the sound of her mother's voice echoing down the hallway. "Valerie, are you ready yet? Hurry up." Her mother's sharp tone pierced the air. Valerie exhaled deeply before stepping out of her room. As she walked down the long hallway, her eyes drifted over the opulent paintings and furniture, which felt more like displays of wealth than elements of a home. Despite being surrounded by everything money could buy, Valerie always felt a sense of incompleteness. Her father's distant gaze, forever fixed on his work, and her mother's relentless criticisms left Valerie feeling like a misfit in their perfectly curated world. On the drive to the ski resort, her father was absorbed in reports on his tablet, while her mother busied herself planning a gala dinner over the phone. Valerie stared out the window at the snow-covered peaks, lost in her thoughts. Why? Why does it feel like I have nothing when I have everything? She wondered. Once they arrived, she seized the chance to escape the suffocating weight of their expectations. With her skis strapped on, she headed for the most secluded slopes. For a brief moment, freedom washed over her. The cold wind and falling snow seemed to carry away her worries. But that feeling didn't last. She was unprepared for a patch of hidden ice, and before she could react, she lost control. The speed increased, and panic gripped her. A scream tore through the mountains as she veered off the main trail, tumbling down a steep slope until the impact and freezing cold overwhelmed her completely. Meanwhile, Jacob was making his way back through the snow-laden wilderness, driven by instinct and the loyalty of his sled dogs, who strained against the growing weight of the accumulating snow. He paused, briefly, shivering as the wind shifted, and an eerie chill ran down his spine. It was as though the mountain itself was trying to communicate with him. Scanning his surroundings, he saw nothing but the endless expanse of snow and the encroaching darkness. Sighing, Jacob gave a gentle tug on the harnesses and called out to his team, urging them forward. Farther ahead, Valerie lay motionless, buried beneath the relentless snowfall, as the night settled in with a suffocating stillness. Jacob pushed onward, the icy wind biting at his face like invisible blades. The dogs were tense, their heavy breaths forming fleeting clouds of vapor in the frigid air. Max, ever the leader, plowed forward with determination, but even she seemed to struggle against the mounting drifts. Behind her, Snowy and Spot followed, each pulling with all the strength their bodies could muster. Adjusting the harnesses, Jacob called out words of encouragement. "Let's go, Max. Keep moving, Spot. Push through." A sudden gust of wind whipped sharp snowflakes into his face, and something ahead caught his attention. A dark shape, partially buried in the snow, stood out against the white. Frowning, Jacob slowed the sled, his heart pounding as he squinted to make out what it was. "Probably just a rock," he muttered, though his chest tightened with a sense of unease. Steeling himself, he stepped cautiously toward the figure and knelt down, his breath clouding in the freezing air. Jacob's boots sank deep into the snow as he brushed aside the icy flakes with trembling hands. There she was, a woman. Her pale face was almost entirely buried, strands of blonde hair tangled with hardened chunks of snow. Jacob swallowed hard, his heart pounding as he pressed his rough, frozen fingers against her neck, searching for any sign of life. For a moment, he feared it was too late. Then he felt it, a faint, nearly imperceptible pulse. "She's alive," he whispered, though it defied all logic. The cold had left her body fragile, on the verge of lifelessness. As the wind whipped around him, Jacob took a quick look around, realizing that time was against him. He sprinted back to the sled, grabbed the emergency blankets and his own jacket, and carefully wrapped her in them. Lifting her fragile, glass-like body with the utmost care, he laid her onto the sled. As Jacob secured the blankets around her, the dog seemed to sense the urgency. Max, the lead dog, turned her head back, watching Jacob with sharp, expectant eyes. "Let's go, friends. We have to move fast," he urged. The dogs surged forward, digging deep into their reserves of strength. But Jacob knew the storm was growing fiercer. The wind pressed against them like a wall, and snow quickly buried the trails he knew so well. Every yard was a struggle, and Jacob couldn't help but glance back at the still, motionless figure of the woman. Never leave anyone behind, even when it feels impossible. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind, a prayer of strength against the fear creeping in. But the fear was real. He felt it in the bite of the cold, in his numb fingers, and in the labored strides of his dogs. Jacob's heart suddenly sank. Fresh wolf tracks crossed the path ahead. He stopped, staring at the prints with a furrowed brow. Wolves rarely attacked groups, but hunger during storms made them unpredictable. He couldn't risk staying on that route. "Not today, not now," he muttered, steering the sled onto a longer, more dangerous path. This new route was treacherous, littered with dense trees that blocked visibility and steep hills that slowed their progress. Jacob felt the dogs beginning to falter, especially Spot, who struggled to keep pace with Max and Snowy. Stopping the sled, Jacob knelt beside the small dog. "You've got this, Spot. Just a little further, buddy. We're so close." He stroked the dog's head, seeing the loyalty and determination in its tired eyes. After what felt like an eternity, the cabin came into view. Relief washed over Jacob, but urgency quickly replaced it. They weren't safe yet. He carried the woman, Valerie, as he now knew, inside and placed her near the cold fireplace. His hands trembled as he worked to light a fire. The flames were slow to catch, but when the warmth finally began to spread, he covered her with additional blankets and pressed his hands to hers, willing his warmth to reach her. Her chest rose and fell faintly, irregularly. She was clinging to life, but only just. "Come on, don't give up now," he murmured, his voice almost a plea. The storm continued to rage outside, as if the entire world was conspiring against them, as Jacob watched her. A knot tightened in his chest. He had done everything he could, but the relentless question gnawed at him. Had it been enough? Jacob had just finished layering blankets over Valerie's frail body when another gust of icy wind burst through the poorly secured cabin door. He hurried to reinforce the latch with a sturdy piece of wood. The howling wind outside sounded like a relentless lament, a cruel backdrop to the silent fight for survival unfolding within the walls. The flames in the fireplace flickered weakly, hesitantly, as he fed more logs into the fire. His breath hung in the freezing air, quick and shallow. Jacob's eyes constantly darted between Valerie and the dogs. Max and Snowy lay sprawled on the floor, tongues out as they panted heavily, their sharp eyes still tracking Jacob's every move. Spot, the smallest and most fragile of the group, had curled up near a pile of grain sacks, wheezing softly, but never taking his gaze off his owner. The dogs had given everything on the journey, and Jacob knew they had earned their rest. "You did amazing, my friends," he whispered, gently stroking Max's head before turning his focus back to Valerie. She seemed so delicate that he feared even the slightest touch might harm her. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips remained a shade of blue despite the warmth, gradually spreading through the cabin. Jacob added another blanket, though he knew it wouldn't be enough. Crossing the room to a shelf where his grandmother had once stored dried herbs, he selected a handful of leaves she'd always said could help warm the body. Setting a kettle over the fire, he rubbed Valerie's hands carefully between his own, trying to pass some of his warmth into her fragile form. "You can't give up now," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Not after everything we've been through to make it here." Yet deep down, Jacob knew he was battling an invisible, ruthless enemy, the cold that seemed to have rooted itself inside her, as if it had become a part of her. Outside, the storm showed no signs of relenting. The wind pounded on the cabin walls, akin to the pounding of a war drum. Meanwhile, miles away in the comfort of a luxurious home, Valerie's family teetered on the edge of despair. Her mother paced the polished hardwood floor, the sharp clack of her heels echoing through the room. Her trembling fingers gripped a phone, but every call brought only more bad news. "You should have taken better care of her," she accused, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and anguish. "I'm doing everything I can, Elizabeth," Valerie's father snapped back, raising his voice for the first time. Though he tried to remain calm, his worry was etched deeply into his face. "Do you think I wanted this to happen, that I'm not worried? She's out there, alone, in this storm," Elizabeth shouted, tears streaming down her cheeks. "And we're here, helpless. You never cared enough. Always too busy, always distant." As the two argued, the rescue team battled their way through blinding snow. Visibility was almost non-existent, and the radios crackled with warnings. "We have to suspend the search until the storm lets up," the team leader reluctantly announced. Elizabeth felt the words pierce her deeply, pleading with them to continue. Back in the cabin, Jacob carefully brewed tea with the local herbs and tried to coax Valerie to take a few sips. Supporting her head with one hand, he murmured soothing words, desperate to keep her tethered to life. Just a little. A few drops managed to pass through her trembling lips, and Jacob considered it a small victory. Suddenly, Valerie murmured something, barely louder than a whisper. Jacob leaned in, trying to make sense of it. "What did you say?" he asked softly. But her words were disjointed, and she slipped back into unconsciousness almost immediately. "Don't give up on me now," Jacob pleaded, his voice cracking with fear. He adjusted the blankets around her and pressed his lips together, trying to ignore the tight knot forming in his chest. The sight of Valerie fainting again brought back painful memories of other losses he had endured. He glanced at the dogs, who now watched him silently, as if they too shared his concern. Outside, the wind howled more fiercely, and the small cabin felt fragile and insignificant against nature's unrelenting power. Jacob knew the fight wasn't over. Valerie was alive, but for how long? He had to believe that the warmth of the fire, the healing herbs, and his determination would be enough. Just as Jacob finished securing the cabin door, he heard the sound of an ambulance engine in the distance. He looked out the window and saw the flashing lights cutting through the icy fog. Relief and urgency swelled within him. The ambulance stopped near the entrance, and Jacob opened the door, letting the icy wind rush inside. A nurse stepped out quickly, followed by the driver, both bundled in thick coats. Rose, visibly exhausted, was carefully helped out of the vehicle. Though weak, Jacob's grandmother managed a small smile when she saw him. "My boy," she murmured, reaching out to him. Jacob didn't have time to respond. Instead, he gestured toward the cabin. "Please," he said urgently. "There's an injured woman inside. I found her in the snow. She needs help immediately." The nurse and driver exchanged a serious glance, understanding the situation. "Get the stretcher," the nurse ordered, and the driver ran to the back of the ambulance. Inside the cabin, Valerie remained motionless, her breathing shallow and her lips tinged blue. Jacob watched anxiously as the team entered. The nurse quickly checked Valerie's vital signs. "She's alive, but in critical condition. We need to move her right away." The driver returned with the stretcher, placing it beside Valerie. Jacob helped lift her gently, once again struck by how fragile she felt. The team moved with urgency but precision. The nurse wrapped Valerie in a silver thermal blanket, securing it snugly to preserve her body heat. "We're taking her to the hospital immediately," the nurse said firmly. Jacob watched as they placed Valerie in the ambulance. Before they left, the nurse turned to him. "You saved her life by bringing her here. Now it's our turn to help." Everything at the hospital happened quickly. As soon as the medical staff realized Valerie was the missing young woman, they rushed her to the emergency room. The ambulance nurse explained how Jacob had found her. It wasn't long before Valerie's parents arrived. Elizabeth burst into the hospital, her face streaked with tears, with her husband close behind, trying to stay composed. When they saw Valerie being stabilized on a gurney in the observation room, relief and anguish collided in their expressions. "My daughter, my baby," Elizabeth cried, clutching Valerie's hand tightly. Later, as Valerie began to regain consciousness, a nurse entered the room to check her vitals. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, adjusting to the soft light of the room. In a faint, shaky voice, she asked, "How did I get here?" The nurse smiled warmly as she adjusted the IV attached to Valerie's arm. "A young man found you, rescued you from the snow, and got you here with the help of an ambulance." Valerie blinked in confusion, but before she could ask more, an unexpected sense of gratitude and curiosity about her rescuer washed over her. Meanwhile, Jacob was tidying up the small table near the fireplace when he heard a sound outside. He moved to the frosted window, wiping away the ice with the palm of his hand. His eyes widened as he spotted a large, sleek car slowly pulling up near the cabin. His heart raced. Visitors were rare, and even more so from people who seemed to come from an entirely different world. He opened the door before anyone could knock, letting the icy wind sweep into the cozy space. Valerie appeared first, leaning on her father's arm, a shy smile gracing her face. Her mother followed hesitantly, her steps cautious as her gaze darted around the cabin with a mix of discomfort and curiosity. It was clear she was struggling to reconcile the simplicity of the surroundings with the luxury she was accustomed to. Jacob, still surprised, stepped forward. "You must be Jacob," Valerie said softly, her voice carrying a tone of gratitude. "Please, come in," he said quickly, stepping aside. "It's cold out there." The family entered the cabin, and the contrast between their worlds became strikingly clear. The cabin was modest but warm, heated by the roaring fire Jacob had stoked. The walls were made of weathered wood, and the sparse furniture, though worn and patched, had a charm of its own. Near the fireplace, an elderly woman sat wrapped in a shawl, her eyes curious but cautious as she watched the visitors. Valerie's eyes roamed the space, taking in every detail. Despite its simplicity, the cabin exuded a kind of warmth she wasn't used to feeling at home. Her gaze lingered on shelves lined with jars of dried herbs, a neatly organized workbench in the corner, and a sled near the door, its harness still damp from the snow. "This is my grandmother Rose," Jacob said, breaking the silence. He approached the elderly woman and gently took her hand. "She just returned from the hospital yesterday." Rose greeted them with a kind smile, though her piercing gaze seemed to weigh each of them. "You must be the parents of the young woman my grandson found in the snow," she said. "Yes, that's us," Elizabeth replied, her eyes darting around the room again, clearly uneasy. "We wanted to thank your grandson personally for what he did. He saved our daughter's life." Valerie's father stepped forward and extended his hand to Jacob. "You were incredibly brave," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "I can't thank you enough. If it weren't for you." He trailed off, his voice trembling slightly before regaining composure. "Please, accept this as a token of our gratitude." He pulled an envelope from his pocket and offered it to Jacob. Jacob looked at the envelope, then at their faces, and slowly shook his head. "I can't accept this," he said firmly, but without arrogance. "I just did what anyone should do. Being rewarded for doing the right thing doesn't feel right to me." A tense silence filled the cabin. Elizabeth, visibly unsettled, glanced at Rose, who was observing the interaction with a faint smile of approval. "You're a humble young man," Rose said, addressing her grandson with a tone of pride. That was something he'd learned from his parents, always lending a hand, even when they had so little to give. Valerie, who had remained silent until then, stepped forward. Her eyes met Jacob's, holding something he couldn't quite place. Was it admiration, gratitude, or maybe curiosity? "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. You didn't give up on me, even when it wasn't easy. Jacob looked away, a little embarrassed. I just did what I had to do. I'm glad you're okay. As Valerie took in the stark difference between Jacob's humble life and the extravagance she was used to, her gaze shifted to Rose. There was something special about this place. The modest cabin exuded warmth, built with care, love, and determination. Qualities she realized were missing from her luxurious but cold home. The dogs, lounging near the door, watched the visitors closely. Max perked up as Valerie approached. The young woman hesitated, then extended her hand to pet her. Max accepted, her tail wagging gently. The sled. The dogs, Valerie started, her voice filled with curiosity. That's how you saved me, isn't it? Jacob gave her a small smile and nodded. They're my partners. I couldn't have done it without them. As the car drove away later, Valerie stared out the window, watching the cabin grow smaller in the distance. There was something about Jacob and his life that stayed with her. For the first time, she felt insignificant in the presence of something so simple, yet so profound. Back at the cabin, life returned to its usual rhythm for Jacob. He cared for the dogs, repaired the worn-out sled, and kept the house in order. Yet since Valerie's visit, something had shifted. It was as if the girl he had rescued had left an invisible mark on his mind. He tried to shake those thoughts, focusing on his work, but the silence of the mountains only made her gratitude-filled, curious gaze harder to forget. That afternoon, as Jacob finished feeding the dogs, he heard the crunch of footsteps in the snow. He turned to see Valerie approaching a truck parked at a distance with its engine running. Two uniformed men were unloading something heavy from the back. She waved, a small smile on her lips, but her eyes betrayed a hint of nervousness. Jacob frowned, wiping his hands on his worn pants as he walked toward her. Valerie, what's going on? Hi, Jacob, she replied, stopping in front of him. I brought something for you. I wanted to thank you in a way that would really make a difference. Jacob glanced towards the men, who were setting down a brand new sled. Made of reinforced wood with metal accents, it was clearly designed to handle the harsh mountain conditions. He stared in silence as they placed it carefully near the cabin. Valerie, this isn't necessary, he said, shaking his head while still looking at the sled. I can't accept this. It's too much. Valerie stepped closer and lightly touched his arm, cutting off his protest. Please, Jacob, you saved my life. I know you didn't do it expecting anything in return, but this is something that can help you. You and your dogs deserve better. Jacob glanced at the men, now waiting to leave after finishing the delivery. He sighed, running his hands through his hair in a nervous gesture. He knew how much he needed the sled. His old one was falling apart, requiring endless repairs just to get through another day. But accepting something so expensive went against everything he stood for. All right, Jacob finally said, his reluctance evident in his tone. I'll accept it, but only because it'll help the dogs. They deserve the best. Valerie broke into a broad smile, clearly relieved he hadn't turned her down. It's for them, of course, but also for you. I want to make things easier for you to keep doing what you do, she said warmly. Jacob gave her a shy nod of gratitude as the men helped position the sled near the spot where he stored his gear. The dogs, curious about the new sled, approached cautiously. Leading the pack was Max, her tail wagging as though she approved. This sled was custom-made for terrain like this, Valerie explained, her tone a little unsure. I did a lot of research before ordering it. It's lighter but super durable. I thought it would be perfect for you. Jacob ran his hand over the polished wood and reinforced finishes, clearly impressed by its quality. This is way more than I could have ever imagined, he admitted, stealing a brief glance at her. Thank you, Valerie. Really. As Jacob showed the sled to the dogs, Valerie let her eyes wander around the cabin's interior. Her fingers traced the shelves lined with herbs and handmade tools, lingering on small details that spoke of hard work and resilience. Her gaze eventually landed on a stack of old magazines piled next to a small wooden table. Intrigued, she picked up the top magazine, noticing the yellowed cover and a photograph of a factory prominently displayed. The title, printed in bold letters, read, "Summit Industries Industry, a regional economic pillar." The name evoked memories from her childhood when she had heard her father proudly mention the company. Flipping through the pages, she found photos of workers and articles highlighting the factory's growth. "Find something interesting?" Jacob's voice startled her as he appeared behind her. Valerie turned slightly, surprised at how close he was. "Oh, this," she said, holding up the magazine. The name caught my eye. Summit Industries. Jacob glanced at the magazine in her hands, and a shadow passed over his face. Taking it gently from her, he thumbed through the pages until he stopped at a black and white photo of a group of workers. He pointed to two figures standing in the background, a man and a woman dressed in simple uniforms. "These are my parents," he said quietly, his voice laden with emotion. Valerie leaned in to look closer. The smiles on the faces in the photo were in stark contrast to Jacob's somber tone. "They worked at the factory?" she asked softly. Jacob nodded, closing the magazine carefully and holding it as if it were a treasured relic. "Yeah, for many years. My father, Thomas, was a maintenance technician, and my mother, Anna, worked on the production line. They were so dedicated, always taking extra shifts to make sure we had everything we needed." He paused, drawing a deep breath as if summoning the strength to go on. "But one day there was an explosion. Something went wrong with the safety systems. It happened so fast, no one had time to evacuate. They were there." Feeling the weight of his grief, Valerie struggled to articulate her thoughts, a lump forming in her throat. Jacob's pain was palpable in the room. "Jacob, I'm so sorry," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob shook his head, staring at the ground. "You don't have to apologize." "It happened many years ago," he continued, "but it's something you never truly move past, losing both of them at the same time. It's like carrying a shadow that never fades. Since then, it's just been me and my grandmother." Valerie wanted to say something, anything, to comfort him. But deep down, she knew no words would ever be enough. Still, the mention of Summit Industries stirred something in her mind. She knew her father had been a significant figure in the company, but Jacob didn't seem to make that connection. For now, she decided it was best to leave it that way. As Jacob placed the magazine back on the shelf, Valerie stood silently, a mix of sadness and resolve brewing inside her. She had to understand what had happened to Jacob's parents, and whether her family had played a role in their tragedy. No matter how painful the truth, she couldn't turn away from it. Later, Valerie walked into her father's office with firm steps, ready for a conversation she had avoided since the day she met Jacob. Her father, immersed in his paperwork, looked up at the determined sound of her arrival. "We need to talk," she said bluntly. He removed his glasses and set them on the desk, frowning slightly. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" "Summit Industries," she replied, her tone unwavering. "And Jacob's parents." Her father's frown deepened as confusion clouded his face. "Jacob's parents? Who are you talking about?" "Jacob," she insisted, stepping closer to the desk. "The guy who saved me. He's the son of 2 former employees at Summit Industries. They died in the factory explosion." Her father's expression shifted, as if he were struggling to recall. "There were so many tragedies during that time, Valerie. I can't remember every employee. The company was enormous. I oversaw thousands of people." "But you were the boss," she countered, her voice trembling slightly. "You should know. You were responsible for them." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I was responsible for running operations, not the safety systems. That was a technical failure, Valerie, an accident. There was no way I could have foreseen or prevented it." "So, you never looked into who the victims were?" she asked, frustration creeping into her tone. "Of course, we investigated," he replied defensively. "The families received compensation, and we did what we could, under the circumstances." Valerie shook her head, disbelief written all over her face. "Jacob and his grandmother received nothing. You left them on their own, Dad. You say you did everything you could, but that's just an excuse to avoid feeling guilty." Her father slammed his hand on the desk, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Enough, Valerie. What do you expect me to do now? Reopen old wounds? It won't change anything." At that moment, Elizabeth entered the office, drawn by the heated argument. Her eyes darted between Valerie and her husband, instantly sensing the tension in the air. "What's going on here?" she asked. "We're arguing about an accident that happened years ago, something that can't be undone," her husband replied, exasperated. "It wasn't just an accident," Valerie cut in, turning to her mother. "It's about how he ignored the consequences. Jacob lost his parents. They were employees of the company, and no one did anything to help them." Elizabeth stood quietly for a moment, absorbing her daughter's words. Then, with a deep sigh, she turned to her husband. "It might be time to admit that not everything was handled as it should have been." "What are you talking about, Elizabeth?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. She hesitated, as if debating whether to continue. Then, in a calm yet weighted voice, she said, "I've always suspected that some families were overlooked after that accident. Not because you meant to, but maybe because you weren't paying close enough attention." He stared at her in disbelief. "Are you implying that I deliberately ignored something? That's absurd." "I'm not saying it was intentional," she replied. "But sometimes, in the rush to move forward, we leave important things behind." Valerie took a deep breath, trying to control the growing anger inside her. "Whether it was intentional or not doesn't matter. What matters is that I cannot ignore it. Jacob and his grandmother are still living with the aftermath of that accident, and I'm going to help them, whether you approve or not." Her father's eyes narrowed. "And what exactly do you plan to do?" "I'm going to use our resources to improve their situation and make sure they don't have to keep struggling alone. It's the least we can do." "You're not spending a dime of company funds on this," he replied firmly. "Then I'll do it my own way," Valerie said with determination. The argument continued until she walked out of the office, resolute. Her mother followed her, and just before Valerie stepped out of the house, said, "You're stronger than I ever was, Valerie. Go ahead, but know it won't be easy." Valerie nodded, feeling the weight of her mother's words. She knew she would face resistance from every side, but giving up wasn't an option. Jacob had no idea what she was planning, and it was better that way. Meanwhile, she was already crafting a plan to help him, even if it meant going against her own family. The weeks that followed brought unexpected changes to Jacob's life. The cabin, once marked by constant hardship, began to change in subtle but meaningful ways. It started with small improvements. One day, after returning from a delivery, he found a pile of new planks and building materials discreetly left near his cabin. A note accompanied the supplies, signed only by a friend. Jacob frowned, holding the paper in his hands, trying to figure out who could have done this. The note offered no clear clues, and with some reluctance, he decided to accept the materials. The cabin was in desperate need of repairs, and it would be foolish to pass up the chance to create a better space for Rose and the dogs. Soon, other gestures followed. Boxes containing new equipment for the dogs arrived at a local carrier addressed to him. Reinforced harnesses and boots designed to protect the dog's paws from extreme cold were far too expensive for anyone he knew to have purchased. Once again, the package had no sender, but Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that it carried a familiar touch. However, the most surprising change came on a frigid morning, when Jacob received a letter from a regional logistics company. The letter, written formally and addressed to him, offered a steady job with a salary far better than anything he'd ever imagined, along with hours flexible enough for him to take care of Rose. Jacob read and reread the letter, disbelief washing over him. He hadn't applied for any positions recently, and the offer appeared excessively favorable. Despite his lingering doubts, he decided to accept the job. What followed in the coming months was a level of stability he had never experienced before. With the new income, he was finally able to afford better medication for Rose, who began showing noticeable improvements in her health. The sled dogs, once worn down from constant use of old equipment, now worked under safer and more efficient conditions. But even as things improved around him, one question lingered in Jacob's mind. Valerie. Could she somehow be behind all of this? The suspicion grew, though he had no evidence to confirm it. Valerie hadn't been back since her last visit to the cabin, and Jacob knew asking her outright would get him nowhere. Meanwhile, Valerie quietly watched from afar, satisfied with how her plan was unfolding. She had carefully leveraged her resources to transform Jacob's life without directly intruding. She hired local workers to renovate the cabin, making it seem like part of a community project, and used her connections to ensure the logistics company hired Jacob without ever linking it back to her. Still, Valerie couldn't ignore the weight on her conscience. Every step she took to help him made her realize how much she was emotionally invested. It wasn't just guilt or gratitude. Jacob symbolized something bigger, a life of simplicity, dignity, and resilience, qualities absent from the excesses of her own world. Now on stable ground, Jacob began to think beyond his own needs. Inspired by the support he had received, he started helping others in his community who faced challenges like his. He assisted neighbors, cared for sled dogs whose owners were unable to, and applied his newly gained skills at work to improve local logistics. Yet the question of who was behind his transformation never quite left his thoughts. One evening, while organizing supplies in the cabin, Jacob noticed something he had almost overlooked: a small mark on one of the new tools he'd received. It was a symbol he recognized from a magazine Valerie had flipped through during her visit, the logo of Summit Industries, a company tied to her world. He froze, the tool in hand, as his mind raced. Could Valerie have orchestrated all this? And if so, why had she kept it from him? Later that night, Jacob went for a walk under the stars. The biting cold air sharpened his thoughts as he gazed at the distant mountains. Something shifted within him. Perhaps it didn't matter who was behind the changes in his life. What truly mattered was what he would do with the opportunities he'd been given. On a quiet morning, Jacob decided to reorganize the cabin. Life had reached a balance he never thought possible. The once weathered walls now stood sturdy against the cold. The sled dogs rested peacefully on makeshift mattresses, while the crackling fireplace filled the cabin with warmth and comfort. As he moved an old drawer to clean, something caught his eye: a small piece of folded paper wedged in a crack. Jacob frowned, carefully pulling it out. It was a handwritten note, penned in an elegant script he immediately recognized. Sometimes, helping someone else becomes the best way to heal yourself. Thank you for teaching me that. Jacob stood frozen, reading and rereading the words. His heart raced, and a wave of emotions swept over him. Everything started to make sense. The upgrades to the cabin, the gear for the dogs, the new job. It all pointed back to Valerie. He closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. He wasn't sure whether to feel gratitude, surprise, or even a twinge of frustration that she'd kept it all a secret. But above all else, he felt something deeper, something words could barely capture. A profound respect and admiration for who Valerie truly was. Jacob rose and stepped outside the cabin, where the dogs stirred at his presence. Max lifted her head and padded toward him, wagging her tail with unwavering loyalty. He crouched down and gently stroked her head, his gaze drifting to the distant mountains, now blanketed in a fresh layer of snow. "You knew, didn't you, Max?" he murmured with a soft smile, as if the dogs had sensed something he was only beginning to understand. Valerie's words echoed in his mind. Helping someone else is the best way to heal yourself. He contemplated the profound transformation in his life since the day he discovered her struggling in the snow. That choice, not to leave her behind, had set off a chain of events that didn't just reshape his reality, but also transformed the way he saw the world. Looking out at the mountains, Jacob felt a calmness he hadn't known in years. He knew he would never be the same, not just because his life had improved, but because he'd learned that even the simplest acts of kindness could spark profound and unexpected changes. As the dogs gathered around him, Jacob ran his hand over each one, whispering words of affection. He understood that the journey that had started in that snowstorm wasn't over. With a reflective smile, he tucked Valerie's note into a safe place, a constant reminder that even in the darkest moments, something extraordinary could emerge. That day, as he gazed at the horizon, Jacob didn't just see snow-covered mountains. He saw the promise of new beginnings, all of it made possible by the courage to help and the generosity of someone who had grasped the true essence of compassion. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.